Welcome to Pullback, the podcast where we challenge ourselves to try something new in ethical consumption. Then we tell you what we learned, fuck-ups and all. I'm Kristen Pugh, and I'm here with Kyla Hewson.
Hello.
And this episode, we're joined by Brianna Botchwey. Brianna is a Ph.D. candidate in political science at the University of Toronto, and she studies the Sustainable Development Goals, #SDG. Brianna, we're so excited to have you on the show to talk about exclusion and privilege and ethical consumption. I think, as you had proposed, we're going to focus on fashion, but I think it's a question that sort of impacts any kind of ethical consumption in sort of various ways. And I know that this is something that you think about a lot, and it was your idea to have an episode on this. So I wonder if maybe you can describe for the listener what generally you mean by privilege and exclusion ethical consumption. Maybe we can start the discussion there.
Yeah. So when you first proposed that I might contribute to the podcast, I was trying to think of something in terms of ethical consumption that, affects me on a daily basis, or at least has affected my ability to consume ethically. And so I was thinking about the ways that I've been excluded from ethical consumption. And so I should say, I'm normally a size 16, and I'm also mixed race, so I have darker skin. Generally size 16, you're like sort of borderline straight size, but also most of the time you're plus size. But I just want to acknowledge that is on the smaller end, right? So I still have access. Like, I can go into most stores and find something that will fit my body. I mean, whether it'll be flattering is a whole other thing, but at least it will fit my body, which is not the case for a lot of other plus size people. And so I just thought, there's this whole subset of people being denied access to ethical consumption, at least when it comes to clothing. And you'll also see this, for example, in beauty, people who have darker skin, or even people who are super, super pale. Although I would say the pale people have access to Korean skincare, which is like amazing, which I'm really sad to not have access to. So I think not a lot of people, they don't think twice when they walk into a store about whether they'll be able to fit into something. They don't think twice when they go shop for beauty products about whether they'll be able to find their shade, right? And that's sort of these privileges that people don't think about, right? Usually when people think about like privilege, they're like, oh, I've had access to so many more resources. I have access to this education or to this job. But, privilege can express itself in these sort of more mundane things like beauty and fashion. So that's sort of what I was thinking about when I think about, privilege and exclusion in this space.
Yeah, I think that's a really good description. And now that you've sort of explained a little bit about how you felt excluded, I wonder if maybe Kyla and I can briefly reflect on that for ourselves as well. Yeah, Kyla, I don't know whether you have any initial thoughts.
I can't relate at all to being excluded from the beauty industry, and that is, I don't know if it's a problem, I guess. I'm a petite little white girl, so I can walk into any makeup shop and there'll be something in my shade, and I can walk into any store and there'll be something in my size. And it's exactly like Brianna said. It's something that I have never ever had to think about, and it's unfair that I can walk around and have this ease of access and so many other people can't.
For sure, yeah. I was thinking about it in terms of the class dimensions, I think, because, throughout my life, my sizes have fluctuated, and so I have sort of got, at certain points in my life, been closer to plus size, but I've never been to a point where I haven't been able to be sized in a store, so I haven't experienced that, and obviously, as a white cisgender woman, I haven't experienced the racial exclusion. So most of my exclusion from ethical consumption is about class. And so I was trying to think about some of the dimensions on which that's happened. And I thought, obviously money, we'll talk about ethical consumption.
Yeah.
And
I guess I could have mentioned that. I can't walk into a Patagonia and buy something.
Girl, not a best fan.
Yeah, that's where I thought you were going to go, but...
Oh, yeah, no, I just felt so, sad about Brianna's examples, because she's right. But yeah, I guess, obviously, I'm poor, I was born poor, I'll probably die poor. I guess, yeah, Kristen, before we get too far away from what you asked me, I'm just going to use that real quick. You mentioned before when I was like, I don't know what to do as a challenge for this. You were like, oh, just look up your favorite brand and see what kind of, diversity they offer in sizes. And I was like, oh, I don't have a favorite brand because everything I own is from a secondhand shop or like maybe a Winners if I decided to treat myself. So the only thing I own that I have like more than one of in the same brand other than my H&M panties, shout out to those comfy things. Is my Hatley pajamas that I treated myself to when they went on steep discount at a shop I worked at last year. And so I looked at the Hatley company for their pajamas because I can't afford to shop anywhere. So I guess I'm excluded in that way, but it's harder to consider that.
No, for sure. And I think it's not just sort of like, when we're talking about class dimensions and exclusion from ethical consumption, it's not just the straight up price of the item. It's also like having the luxury of time to be able to research ethical brands.
Go try stuff on.
Yeah. And like when we're talking about non-clothing items, a lot of the time, like space is a factor too. Like my apartment right now is probably the most space I've had since I left my parents' house, and it's like a 600 square foot apartment. So, like space is a premium for sure. And then also, I think a lot of people in our generation have to move a lot throughout their lives, whether for school or for work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Does it fit in a backpack? No, then I can't own it.
Oh my gosh. I went to, Kyla and I were in Malta, and Kyla was traveling with just a backpack, but not like a backpacker's backpack. She had shoved all her belongings into like a school backpack.
That is like a level of epic. That is amazing.
I was super impressed.
Well
Thank you. I was very proud of myself for many years about it. But now I'm a hoarder, so what are you going to do? Like, I'm in an apartment. I can own things. I have 3 spatulas now.
You have 3 spatulas?
Well, I don't know. Someone gave me one, and I went and bought one, and then I treated myself to a fancy one I saw at Winners. So
You know what? You only live once. If you need 3 spatulas, you need 3 spatulas.
I don't need 3 spatulas. I'm going to be making a run I don't know. I'm donating them something. Anyways, I was also thinking, Kristen, another way that people are going to be excluded now is because of COVID. Anybody who's an at-risk person won't be able to go try on clothing in the stores anymore.
Yeah, that's true. I actually I haven't been clothing shopping since the pandemic started, and I don't know. I have to imagine there'd be a lot of anxiety wrapped up in that. I don't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to go clothes shopping right now, like in person. I mean, you can shop online, a lot of these brands, but that also assumes you have access to internet, you have access to a computer, you have a good sense of how things fit without trying them on. I will say too, even if you can go into a store, if you're perceived to look a certain way, and that can apply to class, that can apply to race. Have you ever had like the shop people look at you weirdly? I feel like if they feel you don't belong in a store, they'll definitely give you like a side eye.
Yeah.
I have experienced that. They'll look at the clothes you're already wearing and be like, you shouldn't be here.
Yeah, they make judgments. Yeah, which is another way that people feel excluded. They feel like they're other, that they don't belong in that space.
Yeah, absolutely.
I actually have a relevant example for this. I walked into a Louis Vuitton because
oh my God.
I was just in the town and I was like, oh, why not, And I was walking around the store and the shopkeeper came over to me and she was like, excuse me. And I was like, oh no, here it comes. And she's like, your shorts have ridden up your butt. And my butt cheek was hanging out of one of my shorts. Like it wasn't even both of them had gone up, just one short had gone up. I was like, thank you, and I left. And then I never wore those shorts again.
Probably a good thing, yeah.
Oh my gosh. All right, so maybe I'll just set out the way I thought we might structure this episode. So Brianna, because you had sort of said you wanted to focus on fashion, and you had mentioned wanting to connect it to our fast fashion series, which I think is a great idea. So I thought that one way to sort of frame that is in our 3rd clothing episode, we talked about the different strategies for building an ethical closet. And there are kind of like, in terms of looking for new clothes, there are 3 strategies that are recommended there. So I thought we could look at exclusion in each of those 3 categories. So the first one is like looking for better big brands. So those are the big brands that are doing better than their peers. The second one is looking for like sustainable superstars, which are slow fashion brands that focus on human rights and sustainability. And then the last one is new to you secondhand clothing. So thrifting, renting, clothes subscription, swapping, and borrowing. Sound good?
Yeah.
Excellent. But before we do that, what I'd like to do is just to talk about what are some of the barriers that people might face in trying to build a more conscious wardrobe. You had listed a few, so I'm wondering if maybe you could just sort of describe what those were and your rationale for including them.
Mm-hmm. Well, the first one we just talked about, really. Well, sort of. I mean, it came up when we were talking about class in terms of cost. I mean, the cost of some of these sustainable fashion clothes is truly astronomical. And part of that is justified. I mean, in theory, because some of them, they'll say they're sustainable and they do weird shenanigans. In theory, they're paying people a living wage. In theory, they're probably made, in Canada or wherever country you're based in. And they're usually made with, like organic or high quality fabrics, right? So you can partially justify having an increased price. I mean, they're never going to be the price of fast fashion. But, I went and bought a pair of jeans the other day, and I'm going to say this was a huge splurge, and they were like almost over $100 for a pair of jeans. Like that is just, most people would not have access to that for a pair of jeans. So I think cost is a huge barrier. And you can also see that in other types of ethical consumption too. Like, I mean, organic food from Whole Foods it's wild.
Oh my God. Sorry. Just related to that. Did you see the quote from the Whole Foods founder?
Oh my God, no. What did they say?
I don't have, I will like tweet about the actual quote because I don't have it available to me. But basically what he was saying was, we tried to put Whole Foods in impoverished neighborhoods and like people didn't want to shop there because people are addicted to unhealthy foods. It's like, maybe it's because it costs like $6 for an organic garlic.
Oh God. Why are they how could they think that would be like an okay response, that they weren't going to be attacked for that? Like, people are so clueless. Anyways, maybe I shouldn't shop at Whole Foods anymore. Yeah, he sounds awful. Yeah. So the next thing that, I alluded to already was in terms of sizing. So most of the sustainable fashion brands I've seen, some of the bigger brands, the more, I guess, what did you call them? The better brands, will go up, have more sizing, because they do cater to, a larger group of people. But most of the like sustainable superstars that you talk about only go up to like a size 12. I just want to reiterate that the average Canadian woman is not a size 12.
For sure, yeah.
So they're cutting out an entire group of people. I think I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think the average woman is like a 14.
Yeah, I found a stat that said most clothing sales are in the category of 14 to 18. I think that was specific to the States, but I can't imagine it's any different here.
No, there might be some variation, but no, I think it's quite similar. And even if they have bigger sizes, and this drives me nuts, is that you can never find them in store. So I don't know whether it's just they don't want bigger people in their store, or it's just that those sizes sell out so quickly in the store. But usually you can only find them online, right? So again, that's another barrier. Do you have access to internet? Do you have access to a computer? Are you able to tell, when something fits you? So that's frustrating. And this is related to sizing and might seem a bit more superficial, but it does matter in terms of style. So a lot of the sustainable plus size clothing I see, it just is not trendy at all. It's, these sort of really ill-fitting things, basically muumuus. I don't know if you've ever worn a muumuu, but it's just like a giant pod, like a tent on your body. Like not all plus size people want to wear those things. And so, if you have somebody who's plus size and wants to wear something that's trendy, but also sustainable, there are not that many options.
Yeah, I was listening to an interview with Alexandra Waldman, who is one of the co-founders of an inclusive fashion brand called Universal Standard, and they make sizes 0 to 40. And she talked about her rationale for creating the company in that she was like trying to find a high quality white t-shirt, which should be super easy to find. But because she's sort of like in plus sizing, she had a really difficult time finding a t-shirt that didn't have like a cat or flowers or something like that on it. And it's like, it's a white t-shirt. You should be able to buy a white t-shirt. Like,
truly. And secondly, we are not all cat people. Like, I would never wear something like that. It'd be a betrayal to my dog. So yeah, I think that's definitely, sizing is a huge barrier, and finding things that are actually like not cats is important. And then related to this, and I don't know if this is more of a barrier or more of something that I think is an exclusion, is also at the level of marketing, right? So when you look at a lot of these, if you go on Instagram, you look at any sustainable fashion brand. I mean, it's better now actually after June's Black Lives Matter sort of movement, but before that, it was so white, right? And mostly a white Western audience too, I would say, that was being marketed at. So it's in terms of the models that they use, in terms of the sizes of the models that they use. I mean, even if they do go up to like a size 10X, for example, they rarely have models that size. So you have no idea how it looks on somebody who's your size.
Yeah, like when a 00 model is showing clothes, I'm like, well, I don't fucking know what breasts are going to look like under that shirt.
No, exactly.
Come on.
Even if you are like a size 0, there are different body styles in size 0. Like, it's just, yeah. So you don't see very much diversity in the marketing, which is unfortunate.
For sure. Yeah. And then I'll just add to that time. I think it's another way that, another barrier to being able to participate in ethical fashion. It's like a lot easier to pop into a mall and grab a pair of jeans from just one of the shops there. And otherwise, you have to know enough to Google search these brands, or you have to have read about sustainable fashion.
Or they're often somewhere that's not as easily accessible by transit, or even just shopping. It sucks if you've got maybe kids with you and you're working a full-time job or two. It's so much easier. Like, oh, I need clothes. The kids need clothes. Let's just go to Walmart.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's one-stop shopping.
So yeah, I think that is it's a very relevant barrier as well. But let's talk about the big brands and problems with inclusive sizing. And I want to start by, Brianna, you had shared a video about Lululemon on your Instagram feed.
Yes.
And I was just hoping you could describe it to listeners to start.
So, as some of you might have heard, Lululemon just launched to a size 20. This was with much pomp and circumstance on their Instagram. There was a really intense video about we've been working on this for 2 years. We're really proud. Anyway, so somebody, plus size blogger, I believe, I don't recall her name off the top of my head, unfortunately, but she made this reel on Instagram. And basically it was sort of mocking Lululemon for this. She was like, so you're going up to a size 20, but you currently go to a size 16. So you're only adding 3 sizes, and it took you 2 years, and you're only adding 3 sizes in 6 styles. To be clear, Lululemon has hundreds of styles.
Yes.
So they're just
and that's just the shorts.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm pretty sure, I'm not even sure they're doing them in different colors. I think it might just be black.
Oh my gosh.
So it's a sort of one of these performative inclusion things. We're oh, look, we think about plus size people. And for context, the owner of Lululemon had once said he doesn't want fat people wearing his clothes. I think he's no longer the owner. I don't know what happened with him. But just for context, in terms of the fat phobia that is so ingrained in Lululemon. And I've never seen a plus size model on their website. So I hope with this new quote unquote collection that they do use plus size models. But we will see. My hopes are not high for Lululemon. Yeah,
for sure. No, it seems absolutely wild that there's such a problem with inclusive sizing, given as Brianna, as you mentioned, most people are in plus sizes. So it seems like a fairly obvious way to make money if you're a big brand, to actually have sizes that fit most people. And also when we're talking about the shift towards sustainability and ethical standards, consumers really care about body positivity and inclusive sizing. It's one of the top 4 considerations that people take into mind when they're looking at the values that companies propose. So I guess my question is like, have you observed a change recently? And if not, like, why not?
Wow, that's a big question. The short answer, I guess, is that yes, there has been a change. However, it's been very, very, very superficial. And it's I would say body positive washing. I guess like you're talking about greenwashing, but body positivity version. So yeah, it would be things like what Lululemon did. Well, they'll go up to like a size 20. Or Anthropology also recently launched. I wouldn't call them a sustainable brand, but they recently launched a plus size collection as well. But again, was it available in stores? No, at least not in Canada. I don't know, maybe in the US it was. And I don't remember what size it went up to, but it wasn't very large either. So they'll make these nods to body positivity, and they'll use like these they will use plus size models, except they'll be sort of an idealized version of plus size models. For example, they'll still have a very flat tummy. They might have like a little bit more thigh there. They'll use people who are very, they're plus size, but they're like an acceptable mode of plus size. As I said, they don't have sort of the lumps and real curves that, some bigger plus size people have. So again, it's sort of like, yes, we're willing to include plus size people, but only on our territory. And the same thing I would say too, if you're looking at race. They'll use models that are more light skinned, for example. They won't use the really darker skin models. And I rarely see anybody with disabilities, like visible disabilities, as a model. So, yeah. And I think why we're seeing this sort of superficial engagement is, as you said, it's sort of a smart profit move right now because people are really, really engaged. Except people are only engaged at a very superficial level, right? They aren't actually, they'll see a plus size model and be like, yay, diversity. And they won't really think about more deep inclusion. Having not just having one post where you have one plus size model who, quite frankly, is not really, is on the smaller side. Having that regularly, like Universal Standards is a really good example of that, because frequently in their marketing, you see different kinds of bodies. And that for me is more true inclusion. But among the bigger brands, I think it's really, really superficial.
Yeah, I want to talk about, I was listening to an interview with a body positivity writer and photographer named Marielle Elizabeth. And she, I thought, had some really smart comments on the reasons that clothing companies have been slow to adopt inclusive sizing. The first thing that she says is basically that until about 5 years ago, the main barrier was just fat phobia and harmful narratives that kind of stem from it. And one of the narratives she was talking about was the idea that there had been this sense in the fashion industry for a long time that larger people don't spend as much on clothing because they're trying to lose weight, which is like so fucked up on so many levels.
We just exist to lose weight.
Yeah, it's like, they're just layers of shittiness in that kind of narrative. And she said that there's been like a lot of progress in smashing narratives of that kind. And that sort of like fashion forward plus size people have really like shown that it's not true. And like some inclusive sizing brands have been making lots of money, and that it's kind of that attitude's kind of starting to change. At any rate, to get to the second thing that Marielle Elizabeth was saying, she's saying that in the last 5 years, it's not so much these fat phobic narratives, because they've been kind of pretty successfully smashed. But now it's more about sort of like the financial investment, because there's an initial cost to introducing inclusive sizing. And she said that's especially true if you're going to be going beyond size 18, just because of apparently the way you would have to sort of redesign clothing a little bit and like rethink what the proportions were after size 18, just because people don't sort of grow on a one-to-one size increase. So like if you're just increasing the proportions as you would in sizes like 0 through 18, it doesn't really work beyond that. So it does like require a little bit of thinking, but it's something that companies should do, and some are starting to do.
Well, especially the bigger companies. And I do understand the financial issue, and actually getting designers who know how to work with plus size bodies might be a challenge. However, I have also seen very small brands on Instagram, who's basically just like a 3-person show, able to go up to like a 10x. And so I think it's less that it's a cost or a barrier, it's just that it's a matter of priorities. is your priority to have inclusive sizing, then you can make it work, especially the large brands. So yes, to a certain extent, but as I said, it's priorities.
No, absolutely. I guess maybe we could talk about sustainable fashion brands specifically. There are a number of slow fashion brands that have introduced inclusive sizing or that started the company with inclusive sizing to begin with. But a lot of them that I've seen they stop at size 18. I don't know. Do you think that that's just inclusive washing, or is it okay for that to be kind of like an intermediate step? I don't know.
Well, I think it's difficult for all three of us to sort of say because none of us are above a size 18, right? So I don't know. And I know that there are many women who are above a size 18. I think if you really are serious about inclusive sizing, you need to go beyond that. I mean, I can understand if you sort of started with that, as long as you made the commitment that you were going to go bigger. But the thing is, when brands do that, when they say, okay, we'll be more inclusive after, it's sort of like, so are those of us who can't fit into your clothes, those of us who can't like find shades or whatever, are we just an afterthought to you? Like, it doesn't sit well with me. I mean, I understand to a certain extent for small brands, but as I said before, it's a matter of priorities. So yeah, I sort of feel kind of funny about it, if that makes sense.
For sure, yeah. And I think that's totally right. That if you think about it as like, who are you excluding when you start, then yeah, perhaps.
What message is that
even
sending?
Small companies. Yeah, because I mean, sustainable fashion brands, oftentimes when they're really, really small, they start with like a made to order kind of approach. And so that doesn't seem particularly harder to do if you're, sizing for every body. So yeah, why can't they?
Yeah, the best examples actually are brands that if they stop at a 2X or whatever, then they offer custom sizing. Now that is another alternative that brands could do, is that if you don't want to, produce like a full collection up to like as many of her sizes are needed, go up to the size that you can with your current resources, but then offer customers the opportunity to put in their measurements and make to order. And there are small brands that do that. Partly because they are sort of smaller operations, so they can, right? They're not sort of trying to minimize their production costs. I mean, they are, but not to the same extent as, say, the bigger brands, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting how the norms are changing too, because it seemed like kind of the first wave in terms of inclusive sizing is like pushing people or pushing companies to produce up to size 18, and now it seems like a lot of the move is to go to size 24. But in both of those cases, you're still excluding a lot of people. So
yeah, I think part of that too is once you start getting over people, remember, this sort of goes back to the point I was making about like acceptable fats versus like non-acceptable fats. And I don't use the term fat in a derogatory term. I mean, there's a whole thing about the body positivity movement sort of taking back that term as not being derogatory. So yeah, the acceptable fats, quote unquote, are like the 18, 24 sometimes, right? That they are, plus size, but they're more acceptable to like the straight size people. But when you're talking about people who are really, really overweight, there are so many stereotypes. And I think they're much more a victim of fat phobia than smaller fat people are, for example. And I wonder whether that's part of it too, that brands don't want to be seen to be catering to this certain group of people because of all the sort of fat phobia that's around it. I mean, I don't remember who you were talking about earlier, that was saying that, there's less fat phobia now. People are, those narratives about fat people have been, or have become less prominent, but they still are prominent for a big segment of plus size people. And so I wonder if that also influences how brands think.
Yeah, for sure. It seems like impossible that it wouldn't affect them in some way. Yeah, I wonder whether we could talk about some sustainable fashion brands. Are there any that sort of come to mind for you as like particularly good or bad on inclusive sizing?
So one of them, which I think most people will have heard of, is Girlfriend Collective, which I know you own a pair of pants. Anyways, yeah, so Girlfriend Collective, which they make activewear that's made from recycled plastic water bottles. So, I mean, they are sustainable in that sense, in that they do use recycled plastic bottles. When I ordered from them, it came from like Hong Kong. So I don't know about their working standards and the whole like having it be flown. probably not great.
Yeah, I mean, they do, just to pop in on that, because I also looked into Girlfriend Collective. They have a good on you rating of great, and that's includes a 5 out of 5 rating for human rights. They have like certification under one of the ISO standards. So I think just to pop in, their workers' rights are probably okay.
That's good to know. And they do have inclusive sizing. They go up to a 6XL. And they do use diverse models, at least when it comes to race and body type. Again, I have not seen models with visible disabilities. They are inclusive, I think, in terms of especially when you're looking at like active wear. I mean, they are like days away from, or years away, sorry, from Lululemon when it comes to inclusion.
Yeah, even like, does Patagonia even do inclusive sizing? Let me see.
They go up to a 2XL, but only in select styles. So even I can't fit into some of their stuff sometimes. Like it's a bit frustrating because Patagonia is nice, and it's also super expensive. Although they do have now a secondhand store as well, which you can buy from. So that's a bit more. But the price is still really expensive, even if you're getting it secondhand.
Oh, maybe I can shop at Patagonia now.
Yeah, in terms of other brands, I'm trying to think of bigger brands people might have heard of. There's one based out of Toronto called Cotton. So they go up to a size 2XL, and I believe their workers' rates are okay because they make it in Egypt, and I think they work with local people there.
Are they the one that's spelled like KOTN?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know why, honestly.
I don't know why.
I guess it's quirky. They do have nice clothes, though, and it does go up, to a 2XL. And sometimes the 2XL will fit bigger people, depending on what the style is. But again, I wouldn't say that's like super, super inclusive. And again, it's not in every style. And usually the plus size stuff sells out like in an hour. It's very frustrating. There's also a brand called Reformation, but again, it's not in every style that they have. It's sort of like a capsule collection, and it's super expensive, and the models they use are just like definitely a very, I don't want to say high standard, but they unattainable beauty standards is how I would describe, I guess, their models. In terms of smaller brands that people might not have heard of, but that I follow on Instagram and I find do a really good job. One of them is called Loud Bodies. And so that was the brand I was talking about when they said, plus sizes are a matter of priority. And so she goes up to a size 10XL. And again, it's a very small shop. I think it's just her and her family, 5 people, and they ship all over the world. And another brand called Pamut, which is based, I think, in the US. And again, she just wrote a post about how it was not difficult to scale clothing. Like if you really make the effort. And I think too, she talked about how often, even if you do decide to have inclusive sizing, you'll often start the design thinking about a straight size person. But this time, she said when she was making her plus size collection, or when she was extending her sizing, she said, you know what, I tried to think about a plus size body first and then design down from that. And I think that's a really revolutionary way of thinking about it, because a lot of the brands that do have inclusive sizing don't do that. And that has implications for fit. It has implications for style.
Yeah, I want to give a shout out for Power of My People. It's a BC-based brand. It's an ethical fashion company. It is pretty pricey, but I've been trying to approach fashion lately with like when I am buying something, I try to buy investment pieces that are super basic. And Power of My People is great for that because they mostly sell button downs, like just one color button downs. Those are going to be in style forever. And they only go up to 3XL, but I think they do go up to it for all of their styles. The other thing I wanted to note, probably we should have said this earlier, but I didn't think about it until just now, which is I'm so sorry, is we haven't talked about adaptive clothing for people with disabilities at all.
Yeah.
But that's totally another way people are excluded in the fashion industry.
Well, I'm just not sure, like generic brands, I don't see any sort of information about like how you can change your clothes. I mean, I guess it's assumed that people with disabilities go to a tailor or something, but that's very pricey.
I saw on Reddit once a guy who didn't have a left leg, and so he always had to buy 2 pairs of shoes, but he only ever needed the right shoe. And he posted about it on Reddit, and somebody who only had the other leg was like, oh, I have the same problem. And they got in touch with each other and they started buying shoes together because they were the same size feet.
I mean, that's so wholesome, but like they should have been able to buy something on their own.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a very positive Reddit story, actually.
I think it was a Reddit story. Maybe I just made it up. I'm pretty sure I heard it once.
Yeah, I think as well, like, there do seem to be like general principles evolving around adaptive clothing. I certainly don't know, like I didn't think to even research it before this episode, so I apologize to people with disabilities that are listening. That really should have been more of a focus. But things like having closures that are Velcro instead of buttons, having like snaps for people that can't raise their arms, zippers with like easier pull tabs. Like I know myself, I've had trouble with like some zippers sometimes on clothing.
Absolutely, yes.
Oh gosh.
Make those things bigger. Yeah, so like there are ways to design clothing for people with disabilities, and maybe that's something that the fashion industry needs to focus on more.
Well, I think it's the same thing when I was talking about, assumptions about what, bigger people do or do not want. I think there's an assumption about what people with disabilities do and do not want. It's an assumption that's wrong. People with disabilities have the right to have clothes. They have the right to have access to sustainable fashion if they want it,
Yeah, they have the right to be fierce.
Yeah.
Do we want to talk about thrift shopping?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I guess tell us about thrift shops and clothing subscriptions and why they're not inclusive.
Yeah, so thrift shops. Now, there's a really prominent plus-size blogger called Stephanie Yeboah, and she talks about this all the time because people always come. Actually, I say she's also a fashion blogger, not only a plus-size blogger. But people always come at her because they're saying that she promotes so much fast fashion, and they should tell her, oh, why don't you go thrift? And she always points out that when skinny people go thrifting, they will often buy plus-size clothing because they're trying to go for like the oversized or like alternative look. So not only do we not have that much supply in thrift shop anyways, but you have skinny people coming in and buying up all of the plus-size clothing. So that's one issue. I mean, even in the first place, there's not that much stock of plus-size clothes in thrift stores. And I don't know whether it's because people aren't donating to thrift stores or consignment shops. They're not getting their plus-size clothes. Maybe because it's so hard to find plus-size clothes in general. So it's really, really difficult if you are plus-size, especially if you're bigger, to find clothes at a thrift shop. So it's not always a solution for plus-size people. Now, in terms of clothing subscription, same thing. I have not seen a clothing subscription that has like anything over a size 16.
No, and to be honest, they're like, I remember looking at clothing subscription companies for our clothing episode, and there weren't that many out there to begin with. So
yeah, it's very new.
Yeah, maybe it's something that'll improve, but I wanted to unpack a little bit more on why the supply of like plus size clothing in secondhand shops is so low. Because I did a little bit of digging on it, and I came up with some factors. One of them is sort of, I think you had mentioned this, but because fashion brands haven't been selling in inclusive sizes, people with larger bodies often haven't had the same level of access to like the high quality pieces that consignment stores often look for. And then at the same time, there's oftentimes like a lot of fat phobia in what consignment stores are like selecting for their inventory. So those are both things that influence it. As well, there is sort of like a documented impact of fat phobia on the livelihoods of people. So there's like people who are in plus size range make, I guess, 90 cents on the dollar of what people who aren't make because of fat phobia and like the ways that it sort of percolates into society. It influences what people have to spend on clothing, but it also means that like there's a really high demand for secondhand clothing in thrift shops. So it's not necessarily that things aren't being donated, although probably there is less of it, but also that like when they are donated, it's in such high demand already, not only because of the demand from people who are plus size, but also, as you mentioned, like people buying in oversized clothing at secondhand stores. And also there's apparently this thing where people will go and they'll buy like plus size items in thrift shops when they're in fun patterns, just like to cut them up and to convert them.
Go to Fabricland. Like that.
Go to Fabricland.
I'm really glad though that you raised the point about sort of the material consequences of fat phobia, aside from just having access to clothes. Like it affects your income. And I think people don't realize that. They're like, oh, why are you people complaining? It's your fault you're fat. Firstly, there are a bunch of reasons why people might be overweight or not. So it's not their fault. And the fact is that they are being discriminated against when it comes to income, like many other marginalized groups. And as you said, that has an impact on what they can and cannot afford and what they can buy. So it really does affect multiple aspects of their lives.
Yeah, I will say that it seems as though there is some change that's starting to happen. There are entrepreneurs that are starting to create body positive consignment and resale stores. And like that's starting to pop up in a few American cities. It's probably not in most Canadian cities yet because we're always like 3 or 4 years behind whatever happens. But the other thing is like online consignment and thrift shops are starting to change that game too. So ThredUp, I think they could be doing better, but they do have up to 4XL on their website. I think why not increase that, But it's a start, I suppose.
I think through Poshmark too, you should be able in theory to buy plus size clothes. But again, with Poshmark, it depends on who's on it. There's also an Instagram account called Sell Trade Plus. But again, it's very small. So there's not really a lot of stock, and they are based in the US and they only occasionally ship to Canada. So that is one barrier.
I wanted to talk about clothing swaps too, because
oh yeah.
Yeah, on its face, like I initially thought clothing swaps, that could be a solution to this problem. I mean, obviously not like a systemic solution, but that's something people could do. But then I kind of thought to my own experience with clothing shops or clothing swaps, and like my own insecurities were like very strongly at play when I've participated in them. And I just wonder whether that might not introduce like some other problematic areas. I don't know. What do you think? Are clothing swaps like a good way to increase access to inclusive fashion?
I feel like they could be, but again, it depends on who shows up. If I went to a clothing swap and it was all like size 4 people, like that's not only am I not going to get any clothes, that's also going to have, negative impact on my, self-image and my body, like how I view my body, and I think as is the case with many other sort of marginalized populations, having, spaces just dedicated to plus size bodies, that could be, a good solution. But I haven't seen any sort of plus size only clothing swaps. So that might be something that, that we need to organize. But I think it does have the potential, but it depends on who shows up. And I think it would be better if it was a plus size only space.
Yeah. Sort of like that's also with thrift stores, something that like having plus size only thrift stores are sort of seen as one of the solutions to.
You still might have one of these people going and looking for fabric.
Yeah, that's true. I feel like there would be a little bit more like side eye happening,
I mean, so I've never done that, but I totally might have without thinking about it. And I just, not to be the naysayer here on that one, but wouldn't it still be better to get fabric secondhand than going and buying it new?
That's true. Yeah. But surely there's another solution.
Yeah, I think it's like if you're going to like a value village and you're not like it's not super high quality clothing that you're getting and there's lots of selection in plus sizes, like I wouldn't feel that conflicted about using the fabric, but
if you walk into like a fancy vintage shop and there's only like 3 large pieces and they're lovely, don't buy them and tear them apart. Okay, noted. I'll just write that down.
Yeah. Please do not do that. There's actually one more solution that I've seen more and more now, and it's sort of like, well, making your own, except I've seen companies that now have make your own kits. So I was looking the other day at buying wool, and they also include like the pattern, so you can literally knit your own sweater and the company will provide the kit for that. However, guess what size they go up to?
Oh no.
An extra large, my friends, an extra large. Apparently bigger people don't knit. I don't know. It's just, yeah, so you see, it's very, very pervasive. But I do think, if we could find some sort of solution in that space too, where, there are more, or plus sizes are more included, that could be another solution. But again, who has time to make their own clothes? Like, and not everybody is good with their hands.
I mean, all they have to do is include extra wool.
I'm learning to knit right now, and it's so fucking hard. It's going so poorly.
What are you even making? It looks like some sort of Zelda hood. Like, is that what you're doing, or just...
I'm making a dishcloth because I was told by the lady in the yarn shop that it was the easiest thing to make. And honestly, I've been working on it for a week, and I've had to redo so many rows because I fuck up one line, and then I have to like meticulously go. Anyway,
well, if it's any consolation, I was trying actually to repair. I hate to say this, a pair of old Lululemons I had, and I don't know how I did this, but I managed to sew the pants to the clothes I was currently wearing.
No.
As I said, it's just not a talent I'm ever going to have. But, I appreciate that some people, are good at sewing. And there's another company called Sew Liberated, and they go up to much, much more inclusive sizing. I don't know off the top of my head, but they provide sewing patterns. And so, if you're a plus size person and if you're good at sewing, that is actually a really great solution. But again, then you have to find fabric as well. And I don't know how expensive fabric is and how that might play in.
That's true. Yeah, I have no idea how expensive fabric is. So do we want to talk about ethical fashion and affordability now?
Sure.
So I think class is, it's another major barrier to participation in ethical fashion. And I know it's been a factor for me, probably a lot of listeners too. So I wanted to dig into some of the reasons for it. And I mean, I think we can start by covering the fact that, like, on a one-to-one basis, if you buy a fast fashion shirt, it's going to be cheaper than slow fashion. There's just no way around that. Lots of blogs have pointed that out. And there is a counter from, like, ethical fashion advocates that sort of say there are ways to spend less on slow fashion, good quality clothes last longer, so it makes sense to buy for longer, which, like, that is a good argument to a certain extent, but I think there are a few limitations to that maybe we can dig into. One of them being that it can be unaffordable to make those one-time investments, even though, like, over 10 years, maybe a really nice pair of, like, boots might be cheaper than having to buy a bunch of fast fashion boots that get destroyed by the Toronto salt every year. But, like, if you can't afford, like, the $500 pair of boots, it doesn't matter if it's cheaper over 10 years if you can't afford to pay for it at the time. So, like, I think affordability is in part about, like, liquidity and people who are on, like, a paycheck to paycheck system, which is most of us. That can be really hard. Then there is questions of class and wardrobe stability. So investing a lot in a few pieces can be a good strategy, but if your size fluctuates, that can make it difficult. Also, if your lifestyle changes, like, I mean, I'm very lucky because as a grad student, I have no expectations about wearing professional things, but, like, people that switch to jobs that have different dress expectations, the idea of having one stable wardrobe if your lifestyle is shifting all the time can be really hard. And then there's just the question of time, right? Like, who has time to learn to make their own clothes and to do that well?
Time is a privilege.
So I don't know.
I have a few reactions to that. In terms of the liquidity issue, I've seen more and more, and I don't think interest is involved, but I could be wrong. I've seen that there's now, like, payment options for certain brands, like where you can pay in installments for a piece of clothing. I've seen Anthropologie does that, for example. So that is one thing that sustainable brands could do. But more fundamentally, if you're a sustainable or an ethical clothing company, to what extent should profit actually be your primary motive, right? Because in theory, you're in this because you want to do something good for the world and you want to make a little bit of money. But your profit margin, you should not be aiming to have the same profit margin as a fast fashion company, I would argue, right? So if your prices are really a reflection of trying to increase your profit margin, I think you really need to look at your priorities as a sustainable and ethical company.
Yeah, and, like, this might be really out of left field, but I actually think more there should be more nonprofit versions of these kinds of things.
Yes,
because, like, really, there's no reason if what you're trying to do is build, like, an ethical ethos. Like, I get it. Profit's great. Money's awesome. But like, if that's not what you're trying to do when you set up your brand, there's really no reason to set up the model that way. And then I think you can ensure that you don't turn into like, you know, a brand that ends up getting sold out and doesn't really reflect any of its values.
Mech.
Mech.
Yeah. I mean, obviously you need to make enough to pay your workers and, you know, make an income yourself. But, you know, it should be, you know, you shouldn't be aiming to be a millionaire if you're in the sustainable or ethical space, I would argue.
Yeah, for sure. So I don't know. I guess maybe that's one solution to questions of affordability is just like if we truly had more businesses that weren't profit focused. I don't know. Secondhand can be a really good solution if the price point is the barrier for you. But if time is the barrier, like I have to go to 3 consignment shops before I find one item I buy. Like it's not quick.
And consignment shops also range a lot in price.
Absolutely.
Even Value Village sometimes, I definitely have a side eye. Like, you know, I always think I'm going to go in there spending maybe like less than $50 and then always end up spending more. I mean, granted, I only generally go in when I'm looking for a Halloween costume, but yeah, maybe that's the problem. But, you know, I do think even in secondhand shops, there is some affordability issues.
Absolutely, yeah. Especially if you're going into like one of the like fancy vintage thrift shops, yeah.
Yeah, if it's marketed as vintage, you're in for like a crazy price for something that like is falling apart.
Yeah, and like if you're going to a high-end consignment store because you want to find like a brand that you really like and you can't afford to pay for it, like that's great. Absolutely do that. Extending the life of clothes is great. So this like discussion about affordability is not to shame people for doing bougie things. Like that's totally okay. But yeah, I don't know what the way around it is. I suppose just like recognizing that everyone has different experiences, identities, and challenges, and that like what you're able to do isn't necessarily what people around you can do, and that's okay. So I think it comes with like, first of all, the duty not to judge other people when you're on your sort of like ethical consumption journey, whatever that looks like.
Oh, absolutely. But like these eco warriors that, you know, judge people so hard if they don't buy a certain way, and they don't realize the types of privilege that they have access to that other people don't. As you said, you need to really, you know, when you're in this space, you have to acknowledge, you know, the different kinds of privileges that you have.
Absolutely. Yeah, I feel like with this podcast, like some of my friends will be like, oh, you know, I bought from this fast fashion brand or whatever, and they're sort of sheepish about it. And it's like, no, like we're doing this podcast to like try our best, but like I still occasionally buy fast fashion because like honestly, sometimes you just don't have the budget for the more sustainable stuff. And like I think as long as you're being like mindful, then it's okay. You know, everybody's on a journey.
That was very eat, pray, love of you.
Oh, God. Oh, my God. Well, as long as you guys didn't accuse me of being goop, that's fine, I guess.
I must admit, I do own a goop product, and I love it. It was really expensive, but it was definitely worth it. Yeah,
what is it? I have to know now.
No, it's not the vagina candle. If that was what you were thinking. No, it's like an exfoliator. I don't know. It just makes my skin feel so soft. But it was definitely pricey. But as I said, my quarter life crisis has been skincare, so I feel like it's what's gotten me through the pandemic.
That's fair. I had that moment when I turned 30. I was like, oh my God, do I have to care about skincare regimens now? The other thing that I had for what you can do to keeping in mind the barriers of affordability and other things, is that like, first of all, don't judge. And secondly, like, I think recognizing these like barriers and exclusions comes with a duty to use your privilege to make ethical consumption easier to access. So that means asking your favorite sustainable brands to size inclusively, to produce makeup in different shades, various things like that. And it also means that you have to help push for those more systemic solutions. So whether that's getting like legislation passed or increasing supply chain traceability, like the things that can help everybody participate. Because ideally you want like the Gap or whatever to be able to be sustainable too. Like just shutting yourself off in your wall of like these super pricey, sustainable fashion brands is not going to get to the solution anyway. But Brianna, you had some really good suggestions about solutions to size inclusivity problems in the fashion industry. So I wonder if you might mind telling us about that.
Yeah, well, I already mentioned a few of them being, plus size only secondhand shopping. So dedicated spaces just for plus size people, more made to order sizing, or tailoring, although I note that tailoring can be sometimes quite expensive as well. And as you said, really pressuring brands to be more inclusive. Brands often will do a survey. So, if they do a survey, ask them to be more inclusive. I think Anthropologie's sort of pivot to having plus size was partly because people in all of the surveys they kept sending out kept saying, we want bigger sizing. And so they responded, these things do matter. And reviews as well do make a difference. I've seen a lot of brands sort of shamed into increasing their shade range because people left reviews being like, well, Black people can't shop here. So what is the point? So I think, as you said, you do have a voice. You could use your dollars and only shop at places that do have inclusive sizing. What I really, really do not think is a solution, and yet I still see people doing it, is telling people who face the different barriers that we've talked about that they just shouldn't consume then. If you can't consume, don't consume.
Oh,
I mean, it's super condescending. Like, it's one thing to make the choice not to buy, like plenty of people do no buy years. Plenty of people decide that they just don't want to engage in capitalism at all.
Yeah, in a perfect world, we'd all stop being consumers.
Right? But, it's one thing to decide not to engage in that, but it's another thing when you don't have choice. And I think,
absolutely,
it's really all these structural factors that are beyond our control that really influence whether or not we have access to these things, and that's not right. Yeah, so I think, part of the onus for sustainable consumption is on us as the individual, to make the right choices, but we need to have like a supply of things among which to make a choice. So I think the brands and suppliers, they need to be more inclusive so that everyone can have access to ethical consumption, no matter, their class, their race, their size, their gender as well. We didn't really talk about that, but, no matter what your situation is, you should be able to consume ethically.
Definitely. So I think those are all the themes I wanted to get through. Usually we do like a call to action. Is there anything that you want to tell listeners to do?
Other than what I just told you, two things. One, if you have a friend who's plus size, do not talk about how you're feeling fat or how you're not feeling like comfortable in your body. Or you can actually, no, you can say you're not feeling comfortable in your body, but don't be like, oh, I feel so fat today. Like, it's so insensitive. Please don't do that. So basically just be conscious of your friend's situation. So not only in terms of size, but, don't talk about things that might make your friends uncomfortable.
Be nice to your friends.
Yeah, basically. And the second thing I will say, because as I was talking to you before this, download the COVID-19 alert app if you are in Canada. I just got an alert that has put me in isolation for 3 days. But you know what? I wouldn't have gotten tested if that app hadn't told me. So do download it, and hopefully you can get access to a test in a timely manner.
Yeah, here's hoping.
Yes, because if you forgot during the course of this podcast, we are still in a pandemic.
And wasn't that a nice however long this episode was?
Yeah. Oh, and one last thing. Make sure if you see a dog that you pet them and tell them that they are a good boy or girl. That would be the last thing I would say.
Ooh, I did that today.
Excellent. Well done.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Brianna. This was absolutely lovely.
Yeah, this was fun.
Did you want listeners to follow you anywhere?
They can follow me on Twitter at Brianna Scrimshaw, but honestly, most of my content is environment and dog stuff, so...
That sounds great.
That sounds like what our listeners are into. So we'll share a link to your Twitter, and people know, of course, that they can follow us on Pullback Podcast. Normally, we just get shade from the palm oil brigade, so, slide into our DMs and send something else.
I didn't even know there was a palm oil brigade. Dear God.
Oh, there is.
The only trolls we've ever had.
Okay, folks, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode. We endorse stealing from Lululemon if you want to wear their clothes. I'm going to cut that out.
All right, so we're just doing crimes now. All right. Oh man.
Oh, gosh.